So welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to host the second roundtable of the COVID-19 pandemic in Africa. Today we are discussing about vaccine trials and communication with the public understanding and fake news. I'm Nadia Diconte, the president of the African Professional for Progress Association. We aim at creating a global network of highly skilled and trained individuals in Africa from the diaspora and also Afro-descendants, and to leverage the knowledge, the know-how, and the skills they all have to benefit the continent and also people abroad. The series of roundtable is co-organized with the Public Learning and Understanding of Science faculty of the Global Emerging Pathogen Treatment Consortium, which aims to build a capacity of relevant stakeholders in states and institutions for Africa. But the plus of faculty really to
Nana? Hi, Nana. Okay, I think we've lost our host. I'll take over from here. I welcome all the participants. I see that we have about 45 participants, and I'm sure a lot more will be joining us. As you know, today we'll be discussing about communication, public understanding, and fake news around COVID-19 vaccine trials in Africa. As some of you might be aware, we have over 88, some talk about 90 vaccine trials going on in the world in general. But we'll be listening to what is happening in terms of Africa. We know that vaccine is really essential when we're talking about public health, because that's the one thing that can stop infections on its track. I think the next session, the next webinar, we might be talking about treatments. There are over 100 candidates treatment trials going on, but we do have very good results with one, and I'm sure we might mention this as we're going on. They're also interested in the use of hydroxychloroquine in combination with other antibiotics in terms of treating COVID. But we do very well know, please, one thing we do know as at this time is that there is no cure for COVID. There are things that can treat the symptoms, reduce the severity of the symptoms, or rather shorten the recovery time. But as at now, there is no cure. And that's a challenge usually with viruses. For this discussion, we have 4 speakers, 4 excellent, well-selected speakers to help address the very issues you might have been thinking of. Please note that you should stay mute, and please ask your questions on the Q&A sessions or the chat session. So you could ask questions or you could contribute, either part. While this discussion is going on, we will be addressing as many questions as possible. But for today, we have 4 brilliant speakers. And the first is Dr. Benjamin Kagina, who is a Senior Research Officer of the Vaccine for Africa Initiative, University of Cape Town. He will be discussing with us the candidate vaccines and clinical testing and how vaccine trials are conducted in general, as well as what Africa benefits, could benefit or will benefit if they participate in COVID-19 vaccine trials. The second speaker is Samuel Otieno. Samuel Otieno is a science and technology journalist based in Nairobi, Kenya. And he will be talking to us about the role of the media, including social media, the role they play with vaccine trials in Africa. We need to harness the power of our local media to improve public understanding and awareness around vaccine. The third speaker is Noni Mumba. Noni works with the KEMRI, Wellcome Trust Research Project, which is located in Kilifi, Kenya. I know Kenya has done excellent research work and a pride to Africa. Noni will be talking to us about community public engagement and vaccine trials during public health emergencies. And this is something we really need to understand, knowing that COVID-19 is a public health emergency. Yes, we might have to conduct trials. And we've had histories in the region about emergencies that also would require trials for us to be able to get therapeutics and vaccines. The last but not the least is Dr. Samuel Ujewe. Dr. Samuel Ujewe is a research fellow at the Canadian Institute for Genomics and Society. He will be discussing with us about the ethics of COVID vaccine research in Africa and the regulatory considerations. Those are things that need to be in place to ensure that humans are used. At this point, I will hand over to Dr. Benjamin Kagina, and welcome.
Thank you, Nana. Thank you, Morenike, for the introduction and for having me. I'm very happy to talk to the attendees about how vaccines trials are conducted in general, and also give you a brief overview about some of the vaccine candidates on COVID-19 that are currently being tested. And I will finally talk a little bit about the benefit of African countries participating in COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials. So perhaps let me start by explaining how vaccine clinical trial is done. So usually it's a long process. And before a vaccine is tested in humans, there are actually a couple of many steps that have happened in the lab and in animal models. So those are called preclinical stages, and I'm not going to talk about that. But what you need to know is that the sponsor or the vaccine developer has to have that data from the lab and from the animal models to be able to convince the regulator, who is a very important stakeholder in the testing process, because the regulator has to register the vaccine product to be tested. So once the preclinical data shows promise, and promise means that it shows it's safe, and it generates an immune response that protects you from getting the virus that causes COVID-19. Then you can say, I'm ready to go to human tests. So for human tests, at the beginning, you have to go on very few numbers, obviously for safety reasons. But let me now take you through quickly how that process works. So it's a very expensive process and very resource demanding. So a lot of care has to be put into this. So the sponsor who has designed the vaccine identify a trial site, a clinical trial site. And once the sponsor approaches the clinical trial site, the sponsor has to make sure that the site has the right infrastructure, which means the research infrastructure as well as the human resource, which is key to make sure that they can conduct the study. The vaccine trial site is usually headed by the principal investigator, who is supported by a big team of researchers and nurses, coordinators, pharmacists, and so on. They then work with the sponsor to develop what is called a study protocol. So this study protocol details the background of this product, including the tests that were done in animals, and including the scientific question that this trial is going to answer. And then after the protocol has been developed by the sponsor and the PI with his team or her team, then the next step is for this protocol to be approved. And who needs to approve this is the institutional review board, which makes sure that the protocol adheres to ethical requirement and is also stands the test of scientific rigor. And then once that is approved, also importantly, as I mentioned earlier, the sponsor must make sure that the product that is being tested, in this case vaccine, has been registered with the regulator in that country. Then the next step is to, and maybe I should mention here that there's a lot of admin and legal framework that is need to be adhered to. For example, the clinical trial agreement has to be signed between the site and the sponsor, and a lot of contract has to be, which is carefully agreed on, has to be signed. Then the next step is for the PI and the sponsor to make sure that they appoint data and safety monitoring board. This is an independent board that is supposed to make sure that the scientific process of conducting the study is adhered to. And then also you have a monitor who routinely comes and monitor the conduct of the study. So the next step is to implement the protocol, and implementation of the protocol means adhering to what is said to be done in that protocol. This includes who is eligible to participate, and those who are eligible to participate must be consenting to participate and should not be coerced, and whatever product need to be given as indicated in the protocol. Then after the study has recruited the number of participants that need to be recruited, in early phase, you normally don't go beyond 100. It's usually small numbers because the main aim is to look at safety and to look at the immune response. So once the number has been reached, and every time you give the participant product, you need to carefully look at the safety. So once the number has been reached, then the next step is to close the trial. And once you close the trial, then a report is generated, clinical trial report, which includes the statistics, seeing whether you answered the questions that were asked. And then after that, then importantly, it has to be communicated in public so that the people can know whether you answered the question that you put forward to answer in the trial. It is very important to mention that before the start of the study, each trial must be registered in a clinical trial register. This is the international standards and requirement, so no study should be conducted in humans without a trial. So then the next is to talk about what are the vaccine candidates that we have. Currently, we have over 100 vaccine candidates undergoing preclinical. Remember, I say preclinical is in the lab and in animals. And then for the clinical testing, which is early phase 1 and part 2, we have currently 8 candidate vaccines. And these vaccines broadly falls into 3 categories. 3 of them whole virus, which has been inactivated. And then 3 of them, then another 3 is non-replicating viral vectors, meaning that you've got a virus which doesn't cause harm, which doesn't replicate. You insert the antigens from the virus that caused COVID. You select a certain protein. In this case, it's spike protein, inserted into that viral vector and then given to participants. And then the last one is called nucleic acid vaccines. These are where you've got an RNA or DNA type of vaccine, which means when you inject this into human participants, they can actually be able to actively generate the protein of interest, which is inserted in the RNA or in the DNA. And then how many countries currently are participating in clinical trials? So far, I've seen China is already doing trials, USA and UK, and obviously Germany. I think there are a few EU countries. I can't pick up which one, but those are the 4 main countries that I know are conducting novel COVID-19 vaccine candidates. And then
another 30 seconds, we'll round up.
Yeah, and then finally we have BCG vaccine, which is revaccination, which is being tested in South Africa, and Australia and Netherlands are also conducting those tests. And then finally, there's someone who asked a question about which countries are conducting trials. I've answered that, but there's also solidarity trial, which involves treatment, and this is done by over 100 countries, and among them is South Africa. So I think with that, probably there was one last question that was asked about the hub product in Madagascar. The reason that it hasn't gotten a lot of traction is that you need a lot of data to convince people that something works. And I think this is what Madagascar is trying to say. I think with that, I'm going to hand over to Samuel Otieno, who is the next speaker. Thank you.
Dr. I'll talk about the role of media. Actually, the media have a critical role to play in that they bridge the gap between researchers, scientists, and the public health. On one side, the researchers want the public to have a positive attitude towards the vaccine trials. They want the public to volunteer for the trials. On the other side, the public wants the scientists to follow the standards during the trial. So this can only be achieved if media stand tall and have a constructive media coverage. They should share information which is true, which is verified. Media can also achieve this by bringing the scientists together and make them know what the public wants, the information which public wants. Other thing, media can educate the people on what's the importance of vaccine. How will vaccine benefits the continent? Who will be the beneficiary? Another question, my appeal is to the public on social media. I know we have freedom of speech, but we should not use the social media to infringe people. Let's have a boundary. Let us stop sending messages which actually is not verified to the people. It is not verified. We are sending it to the public. This one will create a lot of negativity to people. Another question was about to talk about the harnessing. How can local media harnessing the power of local media to improve the public awareness? Scientists, I am calling upon the scientists and media to work together. Scientists should stop working in silos. Media have the power to influence the public, and working together will enable people to have the information, who will disseminate the information. So my appeal to scientists, let us have a platform whereby we as journalists, we as media, we can be trained on the vaccines and then report what's new is happening to the public. Thank you so much. I hand over to Wilfred.
I think that was supposed to come to me. Okay, yes, yeah. So I'll just pick it up. So Noni here, thank you very much. And so my talk will broadly just look at important aspects for consideration for community engagement for successful conduct of vaccine trials, especially in our context. So I'll start by giving a broad definition of what community engagement is. And this is a process that enables communities to be involved in a meaningful way in processes of research or research conduct, be it a clinical trial or any other research for that matter. Also just to say that community engagement really in vaccine trials, success of vaccine trials is just one component out of many or out of several that need careful thinking and careful planning for successful implementation of vaccine trials. And a community engagement is not on its own magic bullet answer for the success of vaccine trials. So I think it's important for people to keep that in mind. Now, community engagement, what does this do? What community engagement does is it can provide researchers with an opportunity to understand community concerns and community priorities, or priorities of governments, of countries, of ministries, in as far as public health epidemics or public health outbreaks are concerned, and plan how to be responsive to these priorities, even as planning for vaccine trials is being done. It is also very important when people are thinking about community engagement to support vaccine trials, to think critically about what the goals of that engagement are going to be. For example, is the goal of your engagement to enhance recruitment? Is the goal of your engagement to get buy-in and ownership of the vaccine trial from the community? Is the goal of your engagement to enhance understanding of vaccine development processes and importance of vaccine trials amongst African populations? And so it's very important to think about the goal and the aim, and that will help in terms of planning for the rest of the activities for the engagement. Now, during public health emergencies, as we have already had, and we are seeing with COVID-19, is there's a lot of mistrust, conspiracy theories, fake news, misconceptions, owing to various sources of information. As someone has talked about, social media is awash with conspiracy theories. And so this makes community engagement even more important, but also more challenging. But just because it is challenging doesn't mean it should be set aside. It is even more important, as we have seen previously in other pandemics, such as Ebola outbreaks in West Africa and DRC. So it's also important in our context in Africa right now and at this particular time for vaccine trials to think critically about global North versus global South power dynamics, and what this does in management of health, and what this brings in terms of what are the roles of local players, what are the roles of local scientists, who is implementing these vaccine trials in our context, for example, here in Africa. What is the role of other players? So these are critical things that need to be considered, to be put into considerations, including thinking through what type of approaches are going to be used to do this engagement. So how can engagement contribute to the success of vaccine trials? In our experience in our research programs in KEMRI is that we have seen that building relationships, building trust, showing communities that you respect them is very critical and is very important for the success of any research work that is going to be implemented amongst human subjects. So it is very important when you want to build that relationship to map out who is this stakeholder that you want to build a relationship with, who is this community, and what interest do they have in this vaccine trial, what interest do they have in these interventions, prevention or treatment interventions that you're seeking to introduce in the population. And so we are thinking about people or populations or communities such as government ministries, such as the Ministry of Health, other very important policymakers, politicians, staff in facilities, in hospitals, specific patient populations, broader communities, regulatory bodies, and so on and so forth. And so it's really important to engage and sit at a round table and discuss in an honest and open way what are the roles of everybody, what are the benefits that are going to be accrued out of these trials that are coming into this population. It's also very important, and I think the next speaker will speak about ethical issues, but with engagement also comes ethical issues and ethical considerations. And so engagement can also help to think about and unearth some ethical issues that may need to be considered in the conduct of vaccine trials. And also just to say that engagement should be thought about as a continuous process. It is not a one-stop thing. It's not something that you do at the beginning and then forget about. So engagement should be thought about right from the time the study, from when the study hasn't started, to at the conception stage of the study, throughout the study implementation, all the way to the end, up to dissemination of research findings. And finally, very important, to ensure that engagement for vaccine trials complements other existing prevention and treatment interventions that are already being implemented, and that populations and participants will not have a false sense of protection with the trial vaccine that they are getting. Thank you very much, and I will hand over to the next speaker, that is Dr. Samuel Ojawe. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much, Noni. So I'm happy to be able to give my thoughts on the ethics surrounding COVID-19 vaccine trial in Africa. So currently, as we know, there are a few vaccine trials going on around the world, and there are lots of concerns from various African countries and populations about the possibility or the potential of a vaccine trial within the continent and how that is going to affect the population, or what benefits do we get from the potential vaccine trials that we would have. Now, these concerns are historical. So they are not just coming out of the blues, and part of the reason being that traditionally, clinical trials in African context have been exploitative in nature. So that being the sense that we have scientists coming from affluent countries, or we call them Western countries, coming to conduct clinical trials, and in many instances have actually found proof of concept or proof of the efficacy and safety of the drugs. Now, the problem being that whenever these drugs have been approved, it takes several years, sometimes decades, before African populations and perhaps even the populations that were tried can have access. That partly because these drugs would be very expensive, that even African governments may not be able to afford those to be able to subsidize to populations. So it becomes a big worry. So the point becomes that of exploitation. So scientists come, they conduct research, and then there is, if you want, a flight of whatever information, whatever data, and whatever benefit of the drug that has been tried to the Western countries, who become the first beneficiary of the result of that. And so here I want to touch on two key things. One is the concept that we refer to as ethics dumping. So ethics dumping being that scientists could come to a poorer context to conduct a research that may otherwise not be allowed or not be permitted or not be approved in their home country, and partly because of what they may have built into the research protocol. So given that, and as someone has already asked, most African countries have very weak protocol approval processes, and also oversights. Those are very weak in many of the countries. So many researchers see that as an avenue to exploit that weakness and be able to enter into the context and conduct their research. Part of that too is that there is also that large population and willing population to be able to want to participate in research in return for little incentives. And one of the key reasons also why clinical trials tend to happen a lot in African settings and other poorer contexts is because it's very affordable. It costs much less money to the researchers to be able to conduct this research within African context as it would cost them, for example, in North America or in Europe, and they would be spending much less. So ethics dumping becomes like an avenue where these scientists or researchers know that these are the implications. However, but because the systems are weak and there are very little to no oversight, they're able to enter into this situation, into this context, and conduct their research and take whatever product that come out of the research back to the first beneficiary, which is in the West. So that is one of the key concerns that is arising from these numerous discussions that we've had. Now, I would just like to highlight three key events that can actually show why these concerns are valid. Now, early in April, 2 French scientists were on live TV in France and talking about vaccine trials in Europe and in Australia. And one of them interjected saying that, well, look, why don't we go the traditional way? Why don't we take this vaccine trial to Africa, as is often the norm, as with the HIV vaccine trials and lots of the other things. There was a very large social media backlash against that, which was being termed racist. Even though there could be some elements of racism in that, what is important to note here is that this is all wrapped in the idea of ethics dumping. Now, the frame in which that scientist had put this trial would not be tolerated in a European context. However, he sees an opportunity with weak systems, and in his words, we go to Africa where there are vulnerable systems, where people are not using masks and where nurses and doctors are not being protected with PPE. So perhaps that will make for a very wonderful trial, given the exposure that Africans would have. But what he was not seeing is the idea of that ethics dumping, because if you're going to do that trial in Europe, you're going to have a setting where people are wearing masks, people are highly protected. So, and the question is, why would you want to go to a very vulnerable setting to want to conduct that research? So that's the whole idea of ethics dumping. And if we go backward in history, we can see a couple of years ago during the Ebola epidemic, there was an attempt to conduct a trial for a vaccine in Ghana, and the local population revolted against that process. Partly being that they know that there was no record of any Ebola case in Ghana, yet there was an attempt to conduct a vaccine trial in Ghana, which didn't kind of make sense to the people. Now, then go further back 2 decades or more earlier, in Nigeria, there was the meningitis vaccine trial in northern Nigeria, which was covert. People thought they were getting drugs for meningitis, not realizing that they were actually on clinical trial. So that was covered, like a covert mission. And whatever the output of that trial was, of course, did not really benefit those who participated in the trial directly. That created a lot of issues. So these are kind of historical examples that lead us to even what's happening in the present that create real concern in terms of what we would think about as ethics dumping. So now going forward, how do we mitigate? What do we look at to mitigate this kind of situation? The one important thing to look at, and I will talk about 2, but the first is to look at what the African moral outlook is. Now we'll be looking at what are the moral expectations of African populations when it comes to conducting research. Most African populations are not really against having a trial vaccine that could work or getting the vaccines eventually. But the point is to find out what the moral expectations are. And like the previous speaker said, there needs to be that community engagement. To be able to understand what the moral expectations are, we have to engage. There has to be that relationship, building trust and building that communication path that leads us to understand where the local population is coming from and also where the researchers are coming from. And then we have to meet somewhere in the middle to have that understanding. And on the second path, there is also the idea of solidarity. African moral expectation or moral outlook is built on the background of that solidarity. You come to my house, I welcome you, I offer you water, you drink, but then you have to reciprocate. You can't just take the whole bucket of water and go with it without giving anything in return. So solidarity is not just about charity, or it's not just about exploiting the situation, but it's about give and take. So it's a two-way street. And we've heard a lot about solidarity during this COVID-19 outbreak from the WHO and from a lot of other agencies. But solidarity here has to be what becomes of a mutual benefit. And I think that would fall neatly into that moral expectation that would be specifically an African expectation as well from any scientists or any institutions who really want to try any vaccine within the continent. And finally, I would really like to bring this to the limelight. There is a new global code of conduct for research in poor settings. And you can think of it as a global code of conduct for research in African settings. And what that does is it tries to mitigate or to address the issue of ethics dumping. So it tries to ensure that any scientist or any agency or any institution that want to engage with a poor setting, as would be most sub-Saharan African context, would follow 4 key things. One is to ensure that there is fairness in the whole setting of the trial. So fairness being that whatever, for example, if you are trying the COVID-19 vaccine in Kenya, in South Africa, in Nigeria, in Ghana, you want to ensure that the output or the outcome of that trial, if that vaccine becomes viable and it is produced, you want to ensure that that country or that population or that setting within which you conduct that research would be first beneficiaries of this vaccine rather than last beneficiary or perhaps accidental beneficiaries in the end. That would be fairness, one aspect of fairness. Another aspect would be that of respect. So we have African scientists who are variously working on this. We have communities who understand what the problems are. What respect would be also in terms of the local research ethics board. So most African countries have the national ethics board, or other regions within the countries have regional ethics board. All research that need to be conducted, one would be in liaison with the local scientists, and then secondly, in respect in terms of whatever protocols that are on ground. Of course, they would be weak, naturally, because of we don't have the resource and the capacity. However, respecting
30 more seconds.
whatever,
30 more seconds.
Okay, respecting whatever weak resources are there would help to actually ensure that we have a successful trial that benefits everybody in the end. Then the third part is to show that, to be able to demonstrate that that trial actually is in light of the care that the scientists or the researchers have for the local context. And finally, the idea of honesty. So we cannot come and claim that we are trying to help an African context in the light of trial, but then when the events are over or when a result is successful, then we don't repatriate the benefit back to the local context. So these four aspects would be key going forward, looking at ethics and looking at the conduct of clinical trials for vaccine in sub-Saharan Africa. So thank you very much, and back to you, Morenike. Morenike, I am done, so we come over.
Hello? I'm sorry, I got off. Are you true, Samuel? Yeah. I'm sorry, I can't even hear voices anymore.
I'm done. I finished a moment ago.
Oh, sorry then. Yeah, we have a number of questions. Thanks for the brilliant presentation, everyone. We have a number of questions, and I'll be directing them directly to persons. First is to Otino. Fake news are all over, together with conspiracy theories on social media, and even from prominent leaders. Please share with us critical skills that may be needed to help differentiate fake news from genuine ones. Thank you. So Samuel?
Thank you so much for... Actually, everyone in this planet have the right and democracy of information. People can share what they think their mind is. But I'm appealing to the public. We should know where the source of the information is. The public now is hungry to know everything about the vaccine trial, the COVID-19 thing. But to my fellow journalists, we should not lose hope. Let us report what is correct. Let us partner with scientists and researchers to give us what is correct to the public, to the people of Africa. I think with that, we will outdo the fake news in the social media, because I cannot tell people not to log in to their social sites. It's their freedom.
Thank you. So I have another question from Benjamin. It says, Solidarity is a treatment trial. There are other vaccine candidates that can be tested in African countries, such as the adenovirus-based COVID vaccine. Please, would you like to respond to this?
Yes, thank you. Yes, absolutely correct. The solidarity trial, that is for treatment. So the vaccine that the person is saying can be tested. Yes, adenovirus-based vaccine like the one that is being tested in the UK can be tested in Africa. Also, the inactivated, whole virus inactivated can also be tested, as well as the nucleic acid vaccines, the mRNA and RNA can be tested in this setting. So I'm not sure why specifically the person who asked the question was very specific on adenovirus-based vaccine, because I think all the vaccine candidates that are being tested elsewhere in the world, I see them also being able to be tested in our setting.
So just for clarity, Benjamin, there is no solidarity vaccine trial. Is that what you're saying? Because we do know that there's solidarity treatment trials. Are you saying there is no solidarity vaccine trials ongoing or planned?
Yeah. Yes, to the best of my I'm muted. To the best knowledge, to my best knowledge, we do not have solidarity vaccine trial. We have solidarity treatment trial. So vaccine trial are occurring independently in different countries.
Excellent. And is the solidarity treatment trial that you refer to that South Africa is participating in, right?
Yes, that's correct. South Africa is participating in that, and also South Africa is participating in BCG revaccination trial, which is for healthcare workers.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We have another question here. This also goes to Benjamin. There have been many cases of clinical trial outputs that do not directly benefit the countries where the trial was conducted. What is currently being done so that this does not happen with African countries who participate in trials?
Okay, so that's a very good question. So there are one thing I want to flag here is that most vaccine candidates that actually go through clinical trials, a lot of them fail, and only a few of them manage to go past testing and get licensed for public use. And when a vaccine is tested in our setting and eventually becomes successful, and now it's commercialized and it's ready for marketing, I'm not quite sure whether the sponsor and the country where the vaccine was tested usually have any agreement on what should happen once the vaccine becomes successful and it's ready for use. So those are some of the things that are not usually publicly available, because the country may have to have an agreement with the sponsor in terms of, okay, we're going to support you and in terms of doing the testing, and if this becomes successful, we're going to potentially reduce the price for this vaccine to your citizens. That can happen. But one thing that probably would be interesting is to know one specific vaccine that this person who has asked the question could give an example of.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll have to go to another question, and this one goes to Samuel Ujewe. It has to do with ethics. The question says, should we make a distinction between ethics and morals? Ethics concern the community, while morality concerns the individual. I don't know if you could reflect this as concerning what you discussed.
Okay. First of all, just to reiterate, the two terms are kind of embedded in each other, and it's actually very difficult to separate the two. However, I would just like to put it more simply in this form to say, when we talk about morality, we're just looking at more about the concepts, how we meet in terms of our mental framing of what we should do and how we should do things. Now, the ethics specifies the exact things we should do. So morally, we should just say we should be good to each other. But if we come to talk about ethics, say, talk about morality in the context of COVID-19 trials, we say, okay, what is the specific thing we need to do when it comes to clinical trials? Then we say, okay, you cannot come and be dishonest about what the intention of this trial is. So that becomes a more practical outlook of this broad moral thing. But however, what is important here is not debating whether ethics or moral, what does that mean, what the separation is. But what is important here is to understand where we meet, what intentions we have in terms of advocacy for conducting a trial, in terms of trying to get a vaccine that works for everybody. Because right now, at the end of the day, the whole world is looking for a solution to this COVID-19. So if we have a successful vaccine that was tried in Africa, it doesn't mean that only Africans can benefit. But that also does not mean that if a trial was to be conducted in Europe, African populations should not benefit from that trial. So it's about a global solidarity. It's about working for the benefit of the global population. However, in the process of working for the benefit of everyone else, the person who is working for those benefits should also benefit from that. So it's not purely an altruistic approach where we have Africans, for example, volunteering for clinical trials, and in the end, everybody else benefit except them. So it's a mutual process. That's why I talked about that mutual process. So the scientists come from wherever they come from. If their research is allowed and follows the protocols laid down by the review boards in Africa, then they can conduct. However, there's that path where the benefit sharing, which is another thing that we talk about in ethics and research. When that...
Sorry, Samuel, when you're talking about benefit sharing, can you discuss in the next 1 minute about post-trial access plans?
Yes.
When you're talking about that, yes, in the next 1 minute.
So I'll just mention going towards honesty. The idea of benefit sharing comes in place in the sense that we have that engagement with the community and sit down and say, now, this is what we are looking at. This is what we're hoping to get. We're trying to achieve a vaccine. We're trying to come up with a vaccine. But then we have to table out what specifically will this community participating in this trial gain from this. So even if the vaccine does not come out, but their participation, how will they gain? So one way being, right now where this is scramble for PPE and a lot of other things that testing within African context, if that becomes one thing that can be done, that can be contributed to that community, for example, to understand even the scale of COVID-19 within the community, that becomes a benefit for the community in participating in this trial. And of course, if the vaccine becomes successful, then the community also gains from that. That is also benefit sharing. So of course, the researchers would have spent a lot of resources, a lot of money, a lot of manpower, and a lot of other things. However, they have to also share whatever the output, the final output of that. That constitutes benefit sharing. And that is an ethical way to go about vaccine trials in Africa.
Excellent, Samuel. I'll take the last question. We're going to have a number of questions not answered, but Nina, I don't know if you could answer this in terms of the role of governments in facilitating community engagement and dispelling conspiracy theories and fake news. I'm calling on, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think governments have an important role to play in supporting community engagement and also sort of like handling conspiracy theories. Governments provide regulations and frameworks within which meetings can occur, communities can be reached, and discussions can be had in whatever format, whether face-to-face formats or other type of platforms that can be used to reach people. Governments can also offer a voice, a very strong voice. If governments have good relationships with their populations, a trust relationship, then they can also speak and lend a voice towards conspiracy or against conspiracy theories, which then populations would be able to heed to. And so ministries and other opinion leaders should be able to give direction or give some guidance where possible in as far as conspiracy theories are concerned. It's very challenging because even within those governments and within those people, there are different lines of thoughts in as far as vaccine trials are concerned.
Yeah, Noni, just one more question before you leave. In the face of this kind of pandemic, how do we consider or plan for community engagement, even with vaccine research? In just a minute.
Yeah,
where do we start?
Yeah, so as I've said, when you're doing the planning, you will map out the different stakeholders or the different communities that need to be engaged. And you will make a plan for what method or what approach are you going to use to reach those populations. And that plan can involve planning for when you're able to meet with people face-to-face or in close contact. And where that is not possible, also put in place other strategies that can reach people, but can also be engaging, such as using things like radio programs, for example, where it is only maybe one person who is needed in a studio to be with a presenter, and then talk to quite a number of people, allow people to call in, have a dialogue, have a discussion, and try to give people factual information that will help them understand what is correct and what is not correct in as far as vaccine trials and conspiracy theories is concerned.
Thank you, Nino. Final question to Benjamin. Please, could you share with everyone on this platform countries that are participating in vaccine research as of date? Which countries are participating, and where is Africa in all this?
Yes, sure. So for the 8 new COVID-19 vaccines, we have China participating. We've got UK participating. We also have Germany, and also we have USA. So those 4 countries. And then for the BCG revaccination, I'm sure most of you have heard that there are some observations that BCG revaccination could perhaps mitigate the severity of the disease. So South Africa is participating in that trial, BCG revaccination of healthcare workers. Australia is also conducting a BCG vaccination trial, as well as the Netherlands. Yeah, those are the countries that I know are working on that.
Excellent. At this point in time, I would want to thank every single resource person. It's been really engaging and enlightening. I would also want to thank every single participant for sending in responses, discussions, and questions. It's been highly engaging. 3 highlights are for me, which I think we'll take away from this platform. The first is the fact that for the region, we do need a vaccine research. There is a lot of benefits in terms of the region participating. But from what we've heard so far, Africa is poorly engaging. And of course, we have challenges around fake news, which Samuel, as well as Nino, kind of highlighted. One of the bad effects of the fake news, which is my second contribution, where we all have to actively engage in, is the fact that we might be having or developing crops of people that are anti-vaccines. And that anti-vaccines also push them to ask the government not to participate, or have their countries not to participate in vaccine research. And we have examples on the continent where the revolt from the people push the government to actually stop the vaccine research. So there is a lot we need to learn and act about in terms of ensuring that the fake news does not destroy the prospect of the continent. And finally, between Noni and Samuel, we heard that vaccine itself has a whole crop of ethics that goes into it. And this ethics not only ensures that the right thing is done in terms of the science, but the right things are done in terms of social context, including post-trial access. On that note, I would say once again, thanks for the engagement. And at this point in time, I will hand over to Nana to acknowledge and close the session. Nana, are you there? Nana.
Yes, sorry, I'm here. I would like to thank everybody in the audience for the very thought-provoking questions and like this lively discussion that we got from the speakers. And thank the speakers as well for really giving us an input in all different aspects of what clinical vaccines are entering. So this was our second event, and we will be having another one in the coming weeks about therapies. So we hope to see you all there the next time again. And thank you for participating.
Okay. Thanks everyone, and see you next week. Oh, next. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Bye.
Thank you all. Thank you for your time.
Bye.